Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for our pre-meeting. It is 5 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. It is packed. First on our agenda is a discussion around debt affordability analysis. Mitch from Davenport, you are here with us, and it's so good to see you again. Davenport has done a lot of this work for us over the years, and we just greatly appreciate all that you do for us and our community. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you get started.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Mayor. Again, Mitch Bergoglio, Davenport and Company. We have served as the town's financial advisor over the years, assisting with planning for and the issuance of debt and bonds, as well as planning for other capital projects. My colleague Cole Claiborne is here with me today. He's passing around hard copies of our presentation. If you want to take notes, some of these are easier to see in a hard copy, but it is up on the screen as well. I'll give him a second to get all those handed out. So I think everybody's got a copy at this point. So this evening, what we thought we would do is kind of go back through some of the presentations we've discussed over the years, and I know it'll be new to a number of you who are new to the council. And so what we're going to look at is the town's existing tax-supported debt. Before we start thinking about funding capital projects, whether that be with debt or pay-as-you-go capital, we first want to understand, where are you today? What is your credit? And do you have access to borrow money if needed? Just like you would do before you go out and buy a house, you understand what your capacity is to pay for that house. Can I get a mortgage? Can I get pre-qualified? It's kind of what we're doing here starting out, is understanding where you are today with your existing debt. And then we're going to do some forward-looking, looking at your debt capacity and your debt affordability based upon your existing financial condition and policies. Certainly understanding you have a town hall project that you're considering. I know there's been discussions about a potential GO bond referendum coming up. So we want to provide you some perspective around debt capacity and debt affordability around those two items. And then ultimately, maybe for some of you who haven't been through the process with us before, just a high level on issuing debt in North Carolina if you choose to take advantage of some of this debt capacity and debt affordability, some of those decisions that will face you down the road if you go down that path. Okay? I love to keep things conversational, so please don't hesitate to jump in with questions along the way. Don't worry about interrupting me. I'm happy to answer as we go. So starting out on page 7 is a bit of an introduction to the town's credit rating. The town is rated AAA by Moody's and AAA by Standard & Poor's. That's the highest possible credit rating that you could have. That provides you with good access to the capital markets, and that provides you with the lowest possible interest rates for those borrowing compared to your peers. It's a very enviable position to be in. There are 14 other cities and towns in North Carolina with that AAA rating. And you can see those listed on the right-hand side of the page. There are 230 cities and towns nationally that have that AAA rating. And so as we go through this analysis, we're going to be looking at several different key ratios and compared to your policies. And just for perspective, we're going to compare you all to other cities and towns in North Carolina and the national medians so you can see how you stack up. It's one thing to say you're good compared to your policy, but giving you that perspective of how you stack up to other AAA cities and towns, I think, is important as well. Yes, ma'am.
Question. With the 14, well, let me put these back on. The North Carolina AAA cities and towns that you're comparing us to here, are we going to look at their tax rates as well in comparison?
I do not have a tax rate comparison in this analysis this evening. I believe you are the lowest, and I think, Jackie, you tracked this.
So, looking at those 14 municipalities in the last, say, hour at their FY '22 or FY '23 tax rate, lowest one I see besides us is Cary at 34.3 cents. Ours is 24.
And Carrie's, did you just say Carrie was the lowest out of these 14 other than us?
Other than us, I don't remember who it is. I got a sheet of paper at my desk. I think the high one is 63 and a quarter.
Okay, thank you.
And we can certainly, go through more detail and try and pull the absolute most recent we can find if that's helpful as a follow-up. But I know, like I said, Jackie, I think, has been tracking that. So, but we do not have that specific information in here, but hopefully that's the perspective you were looking for there.
Thank you.
Okay. So the town's existing tax-supported debt is $38.8 million as of June 30th of 2022. That's comprised of about $30.8 million of general obligation bonds and about $8 million of installment financing or limited obligation bonds. Essentially, we'll talk about this in more detail later, but essentially a general obligation bond is a pledge of your taxing power, and an installment financing is a mortgage on a building or an asset. So you all have $38.8 million of debt outstanding. That debt is outstanding through fiscal year 2040 at this point. On that $38.8 million of debt or principal outstanding, over time, that's going to result in about $6.7 million in interest paid over the life of the debt that's outstanding. As we go forward, like I mentioned, we're going to look at a series of key debt ratios. And that first ratio we start to introduce on the right-hand side of this page is called the 10-year payout ratio. This is a measure of the percentage of the principal, $38.8 million you have outstanding, that will be repaid over the first 10 years. So your 10-year payout ratio as of fiscal 23 was 78.5%. That means between fiscal 23 and fiscal 32, you all are going to repay roughly $30.4 million of the $38.8 million that's outstanding. And you can see that graphically on page 9. Why this ratio is important is it's a measure of how quickly you are repaying your debt. Are you issuing debt and repaying it in a responsible fashion, or are you issuing debt and deferring the repayment to try to maintain a lower payment in the early years? You all do have a policy on this ratio. It is a minimum of 55%. In this ratio, higher is better. So you have a minimum of 55%. Y'all are at 78.5% right now, well above that policy. On the right-hand side of the page is where we introduce these first peer comparisons. And so let me take a moment to show you how this is set up. I'll walk you through it, and the others are going to be set up the exact same way. You all are up top in the gold bar. So the town of Huntersville is up top, and that's your fiscal 23 information that we're showing. The national AAA median, so those 230 cities and towns that are rated AAA across the country, one of them is you all, is in the light green bar. And then the first dark green bar is the North Carolina AAA median. So the median of those 14 North Carolina cities and towns, and then the individual North Carolina cities and towns are listed down below that median. And so when you look at this, you all are a little bit above that North Carolina AAA median and the national AAA median currently, in very good shape on this ratio, whether it be compared to your policy or compared to these peers. You all have capacity under this policy. Okay? Next policy that we're going to look at here is the debt to assessed value. So this is your debt outstanding, again, $38.8 million, principal outstanding, as a percentage of your tax base. In fiscal year '23, your assessed value was budgeted at just over $10.5 billion. So that $38.8 million on the $10.5 billion of assessed value is roughly 0.37% debt as a percentage of your assessed value. So this is another one of those key ratios that you have a policy on. On this ratio, lower is better. And you have an upper end policy limit not to exceed 2% debt to assessed value. So at 0.3%, you're in very good shape compared to this policy. And again, when you look at your peers on the right-hand side, well below the national and the North Carolina median, and you're kind of right in line with Cary as the lowest in North Carolina of the AAAs in terms of debt as a percentage of assessed value. So once again, there is capacity that exists under this ratio if you choose to use it. Finally, the last one we look at is debt service versus your budget, debt service as a percentage of your annual budget. You all have a policy here, debt service as a percentage of governmental revenues not to exceed 15%. Like debt to assessed value, lower is better on this ratio. So lower than 15% is where you have to be by policy. In fiscal year '23, you all were roughly 7.8% of debt service as a percentage of your governmental revenues. About half the policy level, right? So in good shape there. And then once again, when we look at these peers, you all are on the lower end, below both national and North Carolina medians, and on the lower end of North Carolina in terms of debt service as a percentage of your budget. So taken as a whole, these are your three debt policies, financial policies that you have related to tax-supported debt. Taken as a whole, you're well below your policy limits. You're at the lower end of your peer group, North Carolina and nationally. We would say you have debt capacity to issue additional debt should you choose to use that as a tool to help fund the capital plan, given where you are compared to your policies and your peers around the state and around the country. The related but different question is affordability. Can you pay for it within your existing cash flows, or are there additional revenues required to pay for debt? And so I think about these two concepts, like, again, going back to the mortgage. I can go out and I can get pre-qualified for a $200,000 mortgage, but I've got to look at my monthly budget to figure out, do I have all other expenses that are taking up my monthly paycheck, and I can't afford to pay that mortgage. The bank will give it to me, but I'm not going to be able to pay it back.
The can we and should we?
Exactly.
Got it.
So that's where we go on to debt affordability. This gets small, I know, I apologize, but I think it's important that if we take a moment, we walk through this analysis so you all can see how it's set up, and then we're going to use this as the baseline for our affordability analyses moving forward. So I'm going to kind of walk left to right on this analysis. Column A, this is all done by fiscal year. Column B is our existing debt service. So that $38.8 million of principal amount, what we're showing in column B is the annual principal plus interest payments. What is your out-of-pocket cash flow that you have to pay? Column C is a placeholder for proposed debt service. So when we think about issuing debt for town hall, if you choose to do that, or a potential future GO bond referendum, or any other projects that you might want to issue debt for, we would layer in the proposed debt service there in column C. Column D is CIP pay-as-you-go cash. So if you chose to put down an upfront payment towards a project, or you chose to add pay-as-you-go cash to reduce the amount you're borrowing, we could plug that into column D there. And then column E is a CIP operating impact. For purposes of this analysis tonight, we're not going to use this column. We're focused on the capital budgeting side of things and what is our debt affordability, capital affordability. But we're aware that there's a whole other side to your budget, the operating side, that we don't want to forget about. We have to be mindful of, because as you bring on net new projects, those can come with additional operating costs. So just want to make sure we keep that in mind as we review these potential affordabilities. We are focused on the capital funding side of things, not the operating side of things this evening. Okay? So we total all of that up wrong button. Total all that up in column F. And then columns G, H, and I, we're looking at the revenues that are available. In fiscal year 23, you all budgeted the exact amount needed to pay for your debt service in fiscal 23. Makes sense. You have a balanced budget, and so you've got revenues in fiscal year 23 available to pay that debt service. And this is a key concept here going forward. Working with staff, we've identified that $5,055,000 that you have budgeted for debt service in fiscal year 23 is from sustainable revenues, meaning that's coming from annual revenues, so that we can count on those same dollars being available every year going forward without impacting your budget. Said another way, you can continue to budget $5,055,000 every year going forward without the need to add additional revenues to your debt service budget. Does that make sense? So that's why we flatlined this $5,055,000 every year going forward. Got a placeholder for other revenues if we ever choose to drop those in. And then column I is just going to be the total of those revenues. So then what we're going on to is the cash flows, right? So we start out in column J. And column J is just simply looking at your existing revenues in I versus the expenses in F and calculating the annual surplus deficit. So you can see, starting out in fiscal year 24, your debt service is stepping down from what is the $5.05 million to $4.9 million, which is creating about $111,000 of surplus. That $111,000 in fiscal year 24 could be reapplied to future debt service if you choose to do that. That is what is creating our future debt affordability. And you can see that's growing over time as your existing debt service over in column B is reducing every year. Okay? The other piece that you have available is over in column O. You are starting out with what we're calling a debt service reserve fund balance. So you all have committed general fund balance over the years, set it aside to go towards debt service. And working with staff, we've identified that committed debt service fund balance plus some additional general fund reserves available for a total of approximately $4 million. So between column I, that forecasted surplus deficit from what you've budgeted this year in fiscal 23, plus that debt service reserve fund balance in column O is going to give us our debt affordability. What can we afford? What can we pay for in the future without adding additional revenues? We add additional revenues, that increases the affordability. So let me pause there. I'm happy to answer any questions before we get into sort of forward-looking projections.
Any questions? Nope.
Okay. So the next logical question is, well, what does that mean? We've established we have debt capacity. We've got some debt affordability. Well, can you quantify that? Well, that's where we're going to go. Again, like I said at the beginning, we know you got a town hall project that you're considering. I think the most recent estimates I've seen are 27 to 29 million. And we know there's a potential referendum that you may consider in November of 23. So what we've done is we've looked at this debt capacity and debt affordability analysis, focusing on 3 years for the issuance of debt. Fiscal year 24, which you can think maybe is tied to town hall, maybe a potential referendum, and then fiscal year 26 and 29, which would be likely logical years to issue debt under a general obligation bond referendum that could be voted in fiscal year 24. So Those are the years that we focused on for issuance. Certainly, we can look at other years if you would like to, but that's going to give us our baseline in terms of timing for the issuance. In green, we're going to look at debt capacity. So maximizing that debt to assessed value policy and maximizing that debt service to governmental revenues policy. If we just focus on maximizing each of those, how much debt could we issue and how does that impact our affordability? And then we'll we'll focus on debt affordability. Calculate the maximum amount we can issue in fiscal year 24, 26, and 29 if we issue as quickly as possible. And then maximize debt affordability if we assume the equivalent of 1.5 cents of additional revenue starting in fiscal year 25. The equivalent of 1.5 cents, not saying that's got to be a new 1.5 pennies if you find it elsewhere in your budget or through revaluation or through something else, but just trying to provide some perspective on what additional revenues could mean to your affordability. Okay? So we've got this summarized for you on page 15. All the details of these supporting cases are in the back. If you can't sleep at night, that's a really good resource for you to help you fall asleep. But all those details are in the back if you need it. The summary, I think, gives you the highlights here. So case one, that's maximizing our debt to assessed value policy, right? You have a 2% debt to assessed value policy. You could issue over fiscal year 24 to 29, you could issue roughly $240 million of additional tax-supported debt and still be in compliance down on line 18 with that debt to assessed value policy. You would, however, those red numbers, be out of compliance with your 10-year payout ratio on line 16, and you would be out of compliance with your debt service versus revenues policy there on line 20. You would also be short on your debt affordability, the equivalent of about 16 pennies over time or 14 pennies in fiscal year 24 dollars. Again, we're talking about equivalent tax impacts here to provide perspective, not suggesting that you have to come up with pennies, but you got to come up with the same amount of dollars generated by those pennies. So recognizing that maximizing that debt to assessed value puts us out of compliance with our other two policies is a large number in terms of the affordability. You go on to case two. What if we maximize our debt service to governmental revenues policy? So you see down on line 20, we've maxed that out at 15% at our policy limit. And with that, you could issue roughly $95 million between now and fiscal year 29. That would result in the need for additional revenues as well, roughly 4 to 5.5 pennies equivalent on the tax rate, depending upon when you get those additional revenues. Okay? So if you maximize your debt capacity, you are going to be short on your debt affordability. You're going to have to come up with additional revenues. So that's where we look at case three. And when we did case three, what we did is we maximized your debt affordability as quickly as possible. So in fiscal year 24, that resulted in right at $20 million of additional debt capacity or debt affordability. So you could issue roughly $20 million in fiscal year 24, followed by a marginal amount in 26, just under $600,000, and then another roughly $5.2 million out in 29. So for a total of $25.8 million within your existing debt service budget and those reserves you've set aside for debt service, again, you could fund roughly $25.8 million over this time frame, with $20 million of that coming in fiscal 24. That is going, yes, sir.
This is at 5% interest, not considering inflation?
Yes, sir. This is assuming a 5% interest rate on the debt that we're issuing, 20-year term, and a level principal amortization, meaning if you issue $20 million, you're going to pay back $1 million of principal every year.
And to be clear, you're only looking at just a bucket of money. So you're not necessarily saying what project to use it on. And are you looking at our CIP as well?
Right now, we're focused on just big picture bucket of money, as you said. These could be used for any particular project. We have tried to line up the timing of that debt issuance to line up with a potential town hall, to line up with potential GO referendums, understanding those are out there. But we're not focused on any one particular project.
So we're looking at, in case 3 scenario, you're looking at 20 million for the new town hall and not necessarily looking at any of the other projects that we have in the pipeline.
Or you could be looking at the other projects and not town hall. It's the dollars are just in general 20 million. But we have, to your point, said we know we're going to be issuing town hall roughly in fiscal year 24, so we need to make that our first year of calculating our debt affordability. So you understand how much you have available within your existing resources to fund town hall.
Okay, thank you.
And I think, Jackie, where we ended up was with this amount available, 20 million in fiscal year 24, felt like with that, if we chose to issue debt and plus the other reserves you may have available, could fund town hall at the current estimates within that?
So under the theory of the ARPA funds coming in at about 12 million, if we issued 20 million in debt and paid the difference between 20 million and what the eventual town hall price is, as long as it wasn't more than that 12 million, that would fund it at no change to the tax rate.
What does that do to all of our other projects?
You get to spend money one time. There are a lot of other projects, and I remind you, there's some projects that are not on our CIP, the air filtration system at HFFA being an example of one of them. There are projects that are not on that list, so heavy decisions have to be made.
So
Could it? Yes. Would you? I don't know.
Mitch, would it be possible for you maybe in the spring, when we know what what our revenue neutral is going to look like, would you be willing to run some of these case studies for us then, once we have that information?
Yeah, yes, ma'am, absolutely. We'd be happy to do that. I think that makes a lot of sense. And we can build any of that information in. Certainly happy to come back with that.
Thank you. Did you?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to make sure nobody else had a question.
I was just going to say, last case here, case 4, this is getting the equivalent of 1.5 cents of additional revenue in fiscal year 25. So again, as we think about a potential GO bond referendum, voted in November of 23, that's fiscal year 24, the next budget process that you would be going through after that potential November 23 referendum would be the fiscal year 25 budget. July of 24, fiscal 25. So what we see a lot of times, a strategy we see a lot of times is if a GO bond referendum passes, the impact or additional revenue that is needed to fund that referendum comes in that following budget cycle. So that's kind of the theory behind this case 4. And that additional 1.5 pennies takes you from affordability of 25.8 million to 57.8 million. So you pick up about $32 million of additional capacity with that additional 1.5 cents equivalent revenue. Yes, sir.
And just kind of expounding upon behind that number, the 32 million, it's roughly because, and I want to make sure I understand this 100%. The 1.5 is based on, currently it's what, 1,044,000 per penny, so you're basically getting close to 1.6 million. They're multiplying that out by 20, getting the 32 million, but you're also calculating in a 1% increase year over year?
1% increase, so we're factoring in sort of natural growth. Obviously, you all have grown more quickly than 1% over the years, but we don't want to overdo it. We want to assume conservatively and be able to underpromise, overdeliver.
Appreciate that. I just want to make sure I understand exactly how that 32 million came out. That's how you got there. So if
That's how we got
you looked
there.
at additional pennies, that's how it happens.
Yep, over time.
Jackie, what on average do we grow? Not 1%, but what are we, like 1.5, 1.25?
I think the county projected our growth this year, I'm gonna call it 3.26, I believe. And I get nervous for you to assume more than 2 or 3%. My recollection is that our growth rate was higher than any other municipality in the county.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner.
We did a really good job of talking about things in the budget process, like other capital, but there are other operating things that we might fund as well. Think about personnel changes or operating changes. I'm happy to throw out examples if you want to hear them, but it's important to me that Mitch get to the slide that has the calendar on it of when things need to be done. And if you have questions about what types of debt are suitable for what types of projects, there's not going to be a better resource than Mitch.
I'm going to hold my question.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Boone. He's going to hold his question.
Okay. So just last thing on this slide, for additional perspective, as you think about, what the 1.5 pennies gives us, after that first 1.5 pennies, every additional 1 penny is going to generate roughly $17 to $19 million of additional debt capacity. So you get a little bump from the first penny to penny and a half more, and then every additional penny is roughly 17 to 19 million of additional capacity. So, talked a lot about debt capacity and debt affordability. If you do choose to utilize some of that capacity, you're going to have several decisions ahead of you to make. One of those decisions is going to be, what type of debt do you issue? In North Carolina, we have 4 main options for types of debt that we issue. We have general obligation bonds, which I mentioned this earlier. That's a pledge of the full faith and credit and taxing power of the town. So you are promising to bondholders, when you issue general obligation bonds, that you will raise taxes to pay them. If you approve GO bonds, issue GO debt, the statutory tax cap does not apply. You have to raise taxes to whatever level you need to pay back those GO bonds. So in exchange, that generally gives you the best interest rate, the lowest cost of funds over time, because it's a guarantee that the town is going to pay its debt. Sort of on the flip side, you do have to hold a referendum for that, which takes time, right? We're talking about it now, but you got to wait until November of 2023 to issue it. That timing doesn't always work for projects that you're considering. It's also can be less appropriate when you have to do a project. So if it's a project that you're mandated to do or you have to do to maintain your current level of services, otherwise you will not be able to do those services, it can be less appropriate, because if the referendum fails and you still have to do the project, you are not going to be able to issue debt for a certain period of time to fund that. The Local Government Commission, which we'll get into in a moment, will not approve that debt under their current policies for the same project on which a GO bond failed. So that is sort of the downside. If a referendum fails, you can be in a difficult situation if you do have to fund the project, if it's not an optional project. Installment financings, limited obligation bonds, or certificates of participation. This is a pledge of an asset. So think about a mortgage. If you're going to fund the new town hall, you would put a mortgage on town hall. That would be the security for the lender. It does not require a referendum. It does require a public hearing. And you, again, have to pledge something. So you would be pledging your town hall for what could be a 20-year period of time. And there are options under which you can maybe get some flexibility under that. But that's kind of the flip side. It's going to be almost as good as a GO bond in terms of credit. It's going to be maybe a slightly higher interest rate, varies from market to market. Call it 0.1% on average. You would be paying more, 10 basis points more than a GO bond. Revenue bonds are more appropriate for business-type activities, so think your electric fund. If we fund debt for your electric fund, revenue bond would be an option, but not for this tax-supported debt. The other one down at the bottom is rarely used, special obligation bonds. When it is used, it's often a pledge of sales tax revenue. And it's, in the grand scheme of things, looked at probably slightly less than an installment financing is in terms of credit. So the two biggies are the GO bonds and the installment financings. Those are the most common types of debt. Once we decide what type of debt we're issuing, we're also going to be able to determine what is our preferred method of sale. The two most common are a direct bank loan. We've done this with you all before. This is when we put out a request for proposal to local, regional, and national banks. We ask them for their financing proposals, and then we're able to evaluate those and pick the one that works best for the town. Streamlined process because you've got one investor, you're going to directly to a bank and negotiating directly with that bank to put the financing in place. However, there can be some limitations. When you're working with a bank, they're going to drive how long they're allowing to let you borrow, they're going to drive what the interest rate is, et cetera. So more streamlined process, but you are working with a single investor. Public sale takes a little bit more. This is the issuance of municipal bonds. It is a security transaction where you're issuing municipal bonds. Typically requires a credit rating. You've got to put together an offering document. There's more legal documentation associated with it, so it typically comes at a slightly higher upfront cost. But on average, typically produces lower interest rates over time than the direct bank loan. That varies in market to market, but that's typically going to be your lowest cost option as a public sale. But given the extra upfront cost and time, you do kind of need to have a certain level of amount that you're issuing to make it worthwhile. And then you can always consider state and federal programs to the extent they're available and you qualify. There are typically application processes that are involved. For programs like USDA Rural Development, you have to qualify under certain census tracts, which I suspect will be difficult for you all to do. So big options here for us are typically, for you all as a town, are choosing between a direct bank loan and a public sale. Whatever direction you go, you are going to likely have to get approval of the Local Government Commission in Raleigh. This is a statutorily created body that approves debt that's issued by local governments. The big thing for us to understand here as we start the planning process for potentially issuing debt, for the Local Government Commission, they have to find that the amount that you're borrowing is adequate but not excessive. And for that, they typically require bids and permits to be in hand. So when we think about borrowing for, say, a town hall project or a specific road project or a park project, we have to know that we've got those bids or the majority of bids for that project in hand to satisfy the Local Government Commission that we're borrowing the right amount of money. So that's really going to drive our timing process for when we actually issue the bonds. GO bond referendums. If you go the GO bond route, you will have to hold a GO bond referendum. You can only hold those during a townwide election. So again, November 23 is what we're talking about. The GO bond question must state the purpose for which the bonds will be issued and the not to exceed principal amount for which you would issue those bonds. Those purposes can be very broad. Think parks and rec, streets and sidewalks, or they can be very specific, Gilead Road improvements. Typically, we see folks err on the broader side, so you have more flexibility in spending those proceeds. Can't necessarily combine purposes here unless they're purposes that go together in the same area, like downtown improvement bonds. So you could do water and sewer and street and sidewalk improvements if all of that is in downtown and call those downtown improvement bonds. Yes, ma'am.
Just wanted to be clear that even if you were to go with the broader language in the referendum, you still have to use those dollars specifically for, let's say we, instead of saying Gilead Road, we say road infrastructure, you can't take those dollars and spend it on something other than road infrastructure.
You got it. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Quick question.
Yes, sir.
The first point, this can only be done during a townwide election, so you're saying we couldn't have done it in 2022 and we cannot do it in '24?
I think 22 is a town, yeah, it would be, it's a federal election, so it would be a townwide. So you, not everybody is
So not
different.
necessarily a town election, just an election where everyone in the town is voting on something.
You got it. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
If you go to the referendum and it's approved, the bonds are authorized for an initial period of 7 years. So you have 7 years to issue those GO bonds. If you don't issue them in the first 7 years, you can request an extension from the local government commission. You all as a council would have to take some action, and then the local government commission could approve up to an additional 3 years. So a total of 10-year authorization. And the other big thing is you can't use public funds to advocate for an outcome, positive or negative, on the GO referendum. The only thing you all as a town are allowed to do officially as a town and pay for is educate. That's not sort of statutorily, that's more of a policy thing, and it'll really depend on, did you change the project? There was a town in the area, Union County, that had a Parks and Rec bond fail. They came back within 2 years and revoted the Parks and Rec bond, but it was there were different projects that they included. So it really varies depending upon scenario. Okay, finally, I'm getting to what you wanted me to get to, Jackie. So in terms of the bond referendum process, if you do choose to move forward with a referendum, think 6 to 12 months prior, you need to be doing your planning process and be talking about, as a council, do we want to pursue a referendum, A, and if so, what are the amounts and purposes that we want to pursue, so that staff can begin conversations with the local government commission and be in a position to bring to you the initial resolution which will establish those amounts and purposes for the GO referendum. Your legal actions, your formal actions, have to take place roughly 3 to 6 months prior to the referendum. So starting 6 months prior to the referendum at the latest, in order to get all of the things that you have to do done. This includes, several town board actions, publication of bond orders, adoption of resolutions, holding public hearings, and then there's certain things that have to be filed statutorily, both with your clerk and with the local government commission, talking about the debt you have outstanding, the estimated interest over the life of the bonds, as well as the estimated property tax increases, if any, associated with the bonds. All that has to be filed in roughly that 3 to 6 month period of time before a referendum. 1 to 3 months is more of a logistical process, absentee balance, voter registration deadlines, but during that whole time frame is typically when that voter education process is ongoing, as people are starting to vote on the absentees. And then after the referendum, there's a few steps that you would have to take to authorize the referendum before you can start issuing the bonds. Said I had 45 minutes. A lot of information in just under 45 minutes. I'm happy to follow up with questions as needed, and obviously, Ms. Mayor, we can come back in the spring with other cases at your pleasure.
I do think that would be helpful. Commissioner Boone?
Yeah, I'm going to be pretty quick, and Ms. Huffman, I'd like to discuss this with you at a different time. My other questions, the public sale of municipal bonds and general obligation bonds, which one has the most upfront cost to the bond purchaser?
So to the bond purchaser or the bond issuer? To you all as a town?
Right.
So to you all as a town, those two are not mutually exclusive, but a general obligation bond is going to have the higher upfront cost in terms of the referendum. It costs money to hold the referendum. And then in terms of costs of issuance, a public sale is typically going to have higher cost of issuance than a bank loan will, so more upfront costs. However, you can include those in the financing, and so what we typically look at is what is the overall cost over the life of the loan, incorporating ththose financing costs upfront.
And looking at time, I'll be very brief here. If you could be brief also is, if we do have to, once we do the reevaluation, these figures, which are already very conservative, can change 50%, or you have a percentage that they might change?
Well, I guess the initial debt capacity with no additional revenue is not going to change. We've assumed a fixed dollar amount, so I want to make sure we're all on the same page there. And then what could change is, the extra penny and a half that was generating 32 million. Well, if your revaluation goes up by 20%, round numbers, you could increase that by 20% if you keep that 1.5 cents the same.
And if you didn't keep the 1.5%, it would be 5 or 6%.
So I guess we're talking about, in terms of the scenarios, the cases that we ran, the additional 1.5 cents equivalent of additional revenue. In terms of the assessed value assumptions, the value of a penny, we're assuming a 1% growth rate. So to the extent you have a revaluation and you grow at 20%, that would increase the value of a penny by 20%.
Okay.
I know that's a complicated topic, but I'm happy to dig in offline if you'd like to.
All right. Any other questions at this time? Seeing none, is there a motion to go into closed session? Thank you.
Thank y'all for having me.
Make a motion for closed session pursuant to North Carolina General Statute 143-318.11, Section A, 5, to instruct staff or negotiating agents concerning the price of another material, terms for the acquisition of real property.
There's a motion. There's a second. All those in favor? All right, board, we will retreat to the conference room, and for those of you participating, we will be back.